Hi class, welcome to this recorded lecture for finishing up chapter 13, which is blood vessels. I had a doctor's appointment, so thanks for understanding everything's fine, but I just had a quick doctor's appointment, so thanks for being understanding that we didn't have class. We will have your next lecture exam on Monday, and I'll post an announcement about that, so come next Monday for your next lecture exam. Lab today, Wednesday, is your blood typing kit, so be sure to go to lab today. And then we will see you guys on Monday for the next lecture exam. So we ended chapter 13, finishing up our vein and artery discussion. And now we'll talk about the hepatic portal system, which is a very important circulatory system in the body. And it uses the liver as kind of the center to it. So your liver is a major processing center for substances absorbed by your intestinal tract. So what that means is the food that you eat that goes through your gut gets absorbed in this hepatic portal system that takes all those nutrients, those toxins to the liver for processing. So this portal system specifically is the vascular system that begins with capillaries in the viscera, the organs surrounding your intestines, the stomach, and ends with capillaries in the liver. And it uses the splenic vein and superior mesenteric vein to drain that blood from the viscera, your intestines in the digestive tract, and takes it to the liver for processing. So we have these veins of the hepatic portal system that are surrounding your intestines, your stomach, any place where you might be absorbing nutrients from food you eat or any sort of toxins that you might have ingested. And then these veins take all those toxins and nutrients to the liver for processing. The liver detoxifies them, it stores glucose, it basically sorts out what the good from the bad, and then kind of like filters the blood, and then that blood continues out of the liver as the inferior vena cava to go back to the heart. More veins of the lower limbs, the femoral veins, drain blood from the thigh, empty into the external iliac vein. You have the great saphenous vein, which runs the entire length of the inner leg, and that drains all the way down from the foot and empties into the femoral vein. And the popliteal vein, just like the popliteal artery, has to do with blood from behind the knee and empties also into the femoral vein. So here are some more veins of the lower limb. They all eventually empty into the femoral vein. And again, the great saphenous vein is an interesting one because it lines kind of the whole inner leg. Blood pressure then is important to be regulated in the body, and blood pressure is the measure of the force of blood that it exerts against the blood vessel walls. And systolic pressure refers to the contraction of the heart when the ventricles contract and eject the blood. So systolic pressure will always be higher. And diastolic pressure refers to the relaxation of the heart. So that will always be lower as the blood relaxes or the heart relaxes. And average blood pressure is 120/80, systolic over diastolic pressure. So systolic is always at the top, the larger number, and diastolic pressure is at the bottom. And anything greater than this is considered pre-hypertension or hypertension, which is high blood pressure. And many of you probably know how to measure blood pressure, but to measure blood pressure, we put a cuff around the arm to cut off blood supply to that brachial artery. And if we look over here, we see the degree to which the brachial artery is open. And what we've done is the pressure in the cuff increases so that it feels really tight on your arm. So it's completely blocking blood flow to go through the brachial artery. And then slowly pressure is released and the brachial artery opens again. And the first sound that is heard is kind of the first kind of squirt of blood that goes through, and that will give us the highest pressure reading, as it's the first kind of blood that gets through that artery when it opens again. And that first sound, then we record the pressure at what we hear that first sound, and that's the systolic pressure. Then it's the brachial artery will be blocked or partially open as we continue to release the pressure. And then as we stop hearing the sounds, and again, the sounds that we hear going through are the pulse of blood traveling through the brachial artery as blood kind of passes its way through. And when we stop hearing sounds again, when there's completely no sounds, That means the brachial artery has completely opened, and that will give us the diastolic pressure, which is the pressure of the heart at relaxation. So that's how we measure blood pressure. And again, normal blood pressure is 120/80. We can also measure pulse pressure, which is the difference between the systolic and diastolic. So in a normal person, that would be 40 millimeters of mercury. Millimeters of mercury is just a measurement of pressure, and that's because that's 120 minus 80. And there's several pulse pressure points that can be felt near the large arteries throughout the body. And we kind of mentioned this on Monday, different places in the body to feel the pulse, and those are all labeled for you there. So capillary exchange, most of the exchange occurs across the capillary's walls by diffusion. And blood pressure, the capillary permeability, and osmosis all affect how these fluids move across the capillary walls. The net movement of fluid is always from the blood into the tissues where it's offloading either oxygen or other nutrients. And fluid is always gained in the tissues, and that fluid is always removed by the lymphatic system, which kind of is your catch-all system. It removes excess fluid in the tissues that's gained pretty much from that blood. So here we have capillary exchange. At the arterial end, blood flows through, and then blood diffuses out of the capillaries. About 9/10 of the volume returns to the capillaries and then continues through the venous end. So this is the capillary exchange, the net movement of fluid out of the capillary into the interstitial space at the arterial end, and then the net movement of fluid back into the capillary from the interstitial space. And again, at the capillary level of your blood vessels, this is where all of your nutrients and gases are being exchanged. So oxygen is being offloaded, carbon dioxide is being picked up, and nutrients are being exchanged in the blood as well. The local control of blood flow is achieved by relaxation and contraction of precapillary sphincters, and sphincters will relax, and when they do that, blood flow will increase. And precapillary sphincters are controlled by the metabolic needs of the tissues. So for example, if your tissues need a lot of oxygen, these precapillary sphincters will dilate to allow more blood flow into the capillaries. The concentration of the nutrients also controls blood flow, and blood flow will increase when your oxygen levels decrease. And that makes sense. If the area of the body needs oxygen to function, blood flow will increase to that part of the body to bring oxygen to those tissues. So here we have a look at the precapillary sphincters. So in number 1, these precapillary sphincters are relaxed, so blood is flowing through and into that capillary bed. And in number 2, the precapillary sphincter is contract or constricting that blood flow into the capillary. So blood flow is decreasing into that capillary bed. Nervous control of blood flow, we have the vasomotor center as a part of our sympathetic division, which controls blood vessel diameter. Vasomotor tone is the state of partial constriction of your blood vessels, and this will increase, which causes blood vessels to constrict and your blood pressure to go up. The sympathetic division also regulates hormones, which can control blood flow through the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla, which is a gland on top of the kidneys. And in most of your blood vessels, these hormones will cause constriction, which reduces blood flow. But in some tissues, like your skeletal muscle, your cardiac muscle, your heart, these hormones cause blood vessels to dilate, increasing blood flow to that part of the body. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are your adrenaline hormones. So these will get your muscles ready to act and work, and your heart ready to act and work. So they will cause an increase of blood flow to your heart and skeletal muscles. And this is showing where the vasomotor center is located in the medulla oblongata and how the nervous regulation and control will pass through sympathetic nerve fibers to constrict or dilate blood vessels. Mean arterial pressure then, inadequate blood pressure is required to maintain the blood flow through the blood vessels in the body. Several regulatory mechanisms ensure that blood pressure remains adequate for this task. And mean arterial pressure is a calculated value that reflects an average arterial pressure in various vessels of the body. The body's mean arterial pressure is equal to the cardiac output times the peripheral resistance. And cardiac output is equal to your heart rate times the stroke volume. The heart rate is the number of beats per minute, and stroke volume amount of blood that is ejected. And peripheral resistance is the resistance to blood flow in all of the blood vessels. So we can calculate mean arterial pressure multiplying cardiac output by peripheral resistance. The mean arterial pressure will change in response to changes in heart rate, stroke volume, or peripheral resistance. And the mean arterial pressure actually changes over the lifetime. So at birth, it's about 70 millimeters of mercury, and it's maintained at about 95 millimeters of mercury from adolescence to middle age, and it could reach even up to 110 millimeters of mercury in a healthy older person. So we have different receptors that help to respond to blood pressure in the normal range, and these are our baroreceptor reflexes. They can respond to stretch in the arteries due to increased pressure. They're located in your carotid sinuses and the aortic arch, and any change in peripheral resistance, heart rate, stroke volume, that change will be perceived by these baroreceptor reflexes to try to change blood pressure to keep it into the normal homeostatic range. So here are our baroreceptor reflexes found in the aortic arch, the carotid sinus. They're in a good spot because they're right where blood is being ejected from the heart, and they can monitor blood pressure, and they'll send any sensory information to the brain, into the cardiovascular and vasomotor centers. Increased parasympathetic kind of stimulation of the heart will decrease the heart rate. That's important to remember. And increased sympathetic stimulation of the heart will actually increase the heart rate and the stroke volume. So your sympathetic and parasympathetic division do opposite things. Parasympathetic stimulation decreases the heart rate, and sympathetic stimulation will increase the heart rate. Sympathetic stimulation will also increase vasoconstriction of your blood vessels as well. So here's the baroreceptor effects on blood pressure, and just a look at what happens when homeostasis is disturbed. So let's say, for example, blood pressure goes out of the normal range. Receptors in the control center send a signal to the vasomotor center in the brain, and that they work to make the heart rate and stroke volume decrease and the blood vessels dilate to try to kind of bring our blood pressure back to the normal range. And then on the bottom, if blood pressure gets too low, so blood pressure decreases, we have the baroreceptor reflex controlling that, sending an effector response to try to increase the heart rate and stroke volume, constricting blood vessels to bring blood pressure back up to normal. The chemoreceptor reflex, these are sensitive to changes in blood oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH of the blood. And these receptors are located in carotid bodies and aortic bodies, which lie near the carotid sinuses and aortic arch where the baroreceptors were as well. And they will send action potentials along the sensory nerve to the medulla oblongata. And what these will do, these chemoreceptors will monitor blood carbon dioxide levels and pH levels. If we have decreased oxygen or increased CO2 and decreased pH, this will decrease parasympathetic stimulation, which will try to increase the heart rate, and decreased blood oxygen or increased CO2, decreased pH will increase sympathetic stimulation to try to increase the rate of the heart rate. So we have just different, again, receptors. The chemoreceptors are monitoring blood O2, CO2, and pH levels. The adrenal medulla mechanism, stimuli will increase sympathetic stimulation to the adrenal medulla, which is a part of the adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys. And the adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood, which again are kind of your adrenaline hormones. And they will cause an increase in heart rate, stroke volume, which is the amount of blood that's being ejected, and then vasoconstriction of your blood vessels. And it will also dilate the blood vessels to your skeletal and cardiac muscle to try to shunt blood to your muscles and your heart that will need it during an adrenaline response. So here we have increased stimulation to the medulla oblongata, telling the adrenal medulla, which is kind of the inner part of the adrenal gland, to secrete our adrenaline hormones, our epinephrine and our norepinephrine. The Renin-Angiotensin-Aldosterone Mechanism is a really interesting and fun mechanism that has to do in your kidneys. Whenever you have a decrease in blood pressure or blood volume in an emergency situation, if someone's bleeding externally or internally, your kidneys can pick up on that, kind of put this system into play. So any reduced blood flow causes kidneys to release renin, and renin acts on angiotensinogen to produce angiotensin 1. That eventually gets converted to angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 does two things. It causes vasoconstriction of the blood vessels to try to increase blood pressure. And it also tells the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. And what aldosterone will do is aldosterone will work to retain water in the kidneys to try to increase your blood fluid levels in your kidneys as well. So aldosterone tells your kidneys to conserve sodium and water. So the result is that you're urinating less water out and you're trying to maintain the blood pressure and blood volume levels. So this is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. Again, it's put into gear or kicked into gear when you have any decrease in blood pressure or blood volume. That tells your kidneys to produce renin, and renin eventually, eventually then we are producing angiotensin 2, which tells your adrenal cortex to produce aldosterone, and angiotensin 2 also causes vasoconstriction of the blood vessels. Antidiuretic hormone mechanism. This is when the cells in the hypothalamus release ADH when the concentration of solutes in the plasma increases or blood pressure decreases. And what ADH does is it just tells your kidneys to retain more water. So decrease urine volume, decrease the amount of water you're urinating, and the result is to maintain blood pressure and blood volume. And this is a look at antidiuretic hormone. Again, the goal of antidiuretic hormone is to increase blood volume and blood pressure by telling your kidneys to increase the reabsorption of water so that you're not urinating as much. Long-term control of blood pressure. There's a lot of things that go into this long-term control of blood pressure. I'll let you read through what goes into the long-term control of blood pressure and how your body, again, tries to maintain blood pressure at homeostasis. Aging in blood vessels, arteriosclerosis makes arteries less elastic, and atherosclerosis is a type of arteriosclerosis, but it forms from deposits of materials in the artery walls that can form a plaque that eventually can cause a blockage. And factors that can contribute to atherosclerosis are exercise, smoking, obesity, a diet high in cholesterol and trans fat, as well as some genetics. So this is what happens with an atherosclerotic plaque that builds up. Again, can be due to genetics, but it's also a lot about how you spend your days, how much exercise, what you're eating, and this can eventually form a block, or eventually it can form an increased blood pressure because blood pressure will be increased as it's trying to get through this plaque. And that's the end of this chapter, chapter 13. Thanks for listening, guys. I'll post an announcement about your upcoming lecture exam, and have a great weekend.